The next historical perspective that helps us appreciate the importance of fake news as an idea that really builds on concerns about relationships between history, power, and the media is to look at the concept of propaganda. And in particular, if we look at Howard Becker's early work from the 1940s on black propaganda, we see some really interesting connections between fake news and the concept of black propaganda, um, particularly in regard to the chaos that's caused when we're not quite sure where messages are coming from. And when those messages spread not just through media, but through audiences. So let's start off with a definition of propaganda. So, what I'm going to suggest is that we can see fake news as a variant of a persuasive technique that's traditionally been associated with the notion of propaganda and black propaganda. So, we can begin off with a few definitions. So, Howard Becker begins with a definition of propaganda in general, which he defines as propaganda may be defined as the planned use of any means of communication to impose one's will in an actual or potential conflict situation on anyone not ordinarily disposed to acquiesce peaceably to that will. So what we see here is propaganda has been connected to persuasion, and for most of the 20th century was studied in relation to warfare. But Becker also talked about black propaganda, and black propaganda is the sort of propaganda that really the goal was to really not so much persuade as to undermine the morale and the spirit of the enemy through messages which were basically deceptive in terms of what audiences believed to be true about their origins. An example I'll give of black propaganda is that during World War II, the British set up a number of radio stations that pretended to be broadcast from within Germany. These were radio stations that pretended to be broadcast from within Germany and created by German citizens, um, communicating to fellow German citizens and telling them that the war really wasn't going as Hitler told them was the case. So again, this was called black propaganda because it was deceptive about its roots. It pretended to be from people inside Germany. It was actually coming from London. And this was seen to be particularly effective because this particular form of propaganda wasn't based so much on overt attempts at persuasion as it was on the cultivation of gossip and rumour. And quite often, what black propagandists found was that images were particularly effective forms of creating dissent amongst the enemy. And the reason for this, Becker argued, was is that images are pretty hard to decode. The problem with radio messages was they were quite easy to uncover. So, for example, perhaps the broadcaster who was pretending to be a German, perhaps their accent wasn't quite right, perhaps their use of language wasn't quite right. It was quite easy to trip those sorts of things up. But the use of simple images that started off rumours and got people talking amongst themselves, this was seen as being a particularly effective form of black propaganda. And when we move forward to talk about fake news, we can see again that the image, the importance of images as things that get people gossiping, has become really important again in the form of memes. So one of the things we immediately see is that fake news indeed inherits a lot of the concerns that motivated studies of propaganda in past conflict situations. So what are some of the similarities between World War II black propaganda and fake news? Black propaganda is like fake news. We've got a quote here from Becker. The best outcomes are, of course, achieved by the propagandized themselves. They pass the propaganda along to others far better than agents could. This is particularly true of rumours, jokes, and chalked up slogans, and even of leaflets and newspapers to a considerable extent. In the case of radio, with its direct impact, this is not so much the case, although occasionally a listener may take the risk of inviting others to join him. Mass dissemination of rumours and the like is furthered, naturally enough, when there's widespread distrust of ordinary news sources. So there are two things about black propaganda that really parallel what's going on today. Firstly, we've got the motivation to share alternative forms of information when there's widespread distrust of ordinary news stories. And of course, one of the things that we know is that fake news is an accusation that's very often directed at mainstream news organizations, particularly Donald Trump's ongoing sort of running war with CNN. And then the other thing is that the propaganda, black propaganda, worked best when it was passed between people, when the information was seen as not coming from some kind of media source at all, but when it was seen as actually coming through from people that you knew, people you trusted, coming through interpersonal communication networks. And this is really, really important when we talk about fake news. Now, there's an example here this is an image of a propaganda leaflet that was dropped on African American soldiers during World War II, which purported to show a letter from an African American soldier who was in a German prisoner of war camps, talking about how well treated he was, and that this would have been dropped on probably on his colleagues who were shivering in a trench in a foxhole somewhere, wondering where their next meal was going to be. And this picture of that purports to be of an African American soldier in a prisoner of war camp with a letter written by the African American soldier saying, "Hey, come on over. The Germans treat us really, really well." So this is an example of the sort of black propaganda that was created, and the idea was that this would promote dissent and gossip amongst African American soldiers. Now, the really interesting thing about this particular example is the evidence from World War II suggests that these sorts of communications did have an effect on American army morale, but it was to prompt suspicion of black soldiers amongst white officers. So there was a case where actually an African American regiment, we're talking about segregated army at this point, and an African American regiment was removed from the line, from the frontline duties in the Pacific theater of war, because white officers were fearful that Japanese propaganda that took on a similar form was likely to spread dissent. So that's kind of an interesting kind of idea that this black propaganda affected other people through the role of gossip. So the purpose of this section of our analysis of fake news is to point out that there are some interesting similarities between fake news and black propaganda. Again, alerting us to the importance of recognizing the contemporary interest in fake news as something which is continuing in a tradition of other kinds of ideas that have been connected to history, facts, and the use of media to persuade. And the two things we need to understand that help us contextualize fake news in history is that wartime propagandists quickly realized the potential of undermining morale by spreading rumors through simple visual messages shared through interpersonal connections. So this process is very similar to the sorts of communicative conditions that Wardle sees as being absolutely key to facilitating the power of fake news. So again, this alerts us to the importance of thinking about when we're thinking about new forms of media power, we're not just thinking about communication technologies and things that are new, but we're also thinking about established interpersonal forms of communication. So, in other words, fake news is partly about the convergence between media and interpersonal communication. And this is really an important source of understanding how media create reality. It's something that was first mentioned by the famous communication scholars Elihu Katz and Paul Lazarsfeld in their work on personal influence. And when they were studying the newspaper and radio industries, what they were really interested in is the convergence. Sorry, there's a typo on that, isn't there? Yeah, it's not supposed to be convergence, it's convergence. The way that media became powerful when media communication and interpersonal communication were united through interpersonal connections, through talk, speech, gossip, and those sorts of things. So, through looking at Black propaganda and the relationship between successful Black propaganda, images, and gossip, we begin to see where the roots of the current interests in fake news really lie.